Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Lease Accounting Year 2 Considerations. My name is Jen Cowley, and I'll be your moderator for today. And we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us. Before we begin, I'm just going to go over a couple housekeeping items. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please use your Q&A feature to submit your questions. I'll help monitor those questions, and Caleb and I can answer them throughout the presentation. We'll also leave a few minutes at the end so that we can go over any remaining questions then. And we are offering CPE for this hour, so to get your credit for CPE, you must have registered for the webinar, and you'll also need to answer 3 out of the 4 poll questions that will come out during this webinar. We'll also have a recording of the webinar that will be made available in the coming days, and we will email you a link for that. All right, let me just check if we're getting all of our participants in. I still see they're trickling in, so I might give it about 10 more seconds. I see the numbers are just going up, so let me make sure everyone has a chance to get in. Okay, so for those of you just joining, this is Lease Accounting Year 2 Considerations. And so I'll go ahead and introduce myself and Caleb. My name is Jen Cowley. I have 10 years of experience in public accounting, all with Haney & Company, and I work with both public and private companies. For the last year and a half, I have been acting as the go-between between NetLease and Haney & Company, helping get all of our employees trained in NetLease. And today we've invited Caleb Christensen from NetGain, which is a software powerhouse that helps automate the accounting for leases process. Caleb Christensen is a manager at NetGain, and he works on the NetLease for Firms team. Caleb began his career at Deloitte, auditing both public and private companies. After Deloitte, he worked with a consulting firm that specialized in IPO prep and audit readiness. He has performed multiple ASC 842 calculations in Excel for a variety of industries. So for us here at Haney, I feel like year 1 of ASC 842 went better than we expected. Thanks a lot to NetLease for that, which is the software that we use to help us with this process. Prior to using NetLease, we tried setting up templates and formulas in Excel to handle the new lease standard, and it was honestly a nightmare. So thankfully, we found that it's easy to put the lease information into NetLease, and then it generates information like journal entries and footnote disclosures that are needed over the life of the lease. And so we've found that NetLease has saved our clients time and money. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Haney receives a discount from NetLease, and we're happy to pass that along. So we invited Caleb here to present this webinar to our clients and also to our employees to have this be a resource and a refresher on the lease standard and also the software tool. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Caleb, and he's going to go over some more of the guidance and also walk us through some things that we want to consider as we're going into year 2 of ASC 842.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen. Appreciate that introduction and happy to be here. I'm grateful that Haney's invited me to join you today. Just anecdotally, so I've been on the industry side of things, I've been on the professional services side of things, and I've worked with vendors like NetGain. And it's funny, I remember talking to them with, support questions. And sometimes I felt like they assumed that all I did all year long was work with their product. So they were surprised when I didn't understand how to use their product to interact. I'm under no illusion. That's a big part of why we're here today is I realize that for many of you, even if you've used NetLease before and you've done those 842 implementations before, like last year, maybe you did a bunch last year on the audit side, or maybe, if you're here as a client, maybe you did this last year. I recognize that that is a small piece of everything that you do. So there's probably a ton that you don't remember from last year, or you never had to deal with last year that you're going to this year. So that's a big part of why we're doing this here today is we want to give you a refresher. And to Jen's point, please, let's have this be interactive. I've sat through many webinars where the host just droned on and on the entire time. And it was nice to get the CPE, but a little bit boring. So for your sake and for mine, if you have questions, don't be shy. Please feel free to drop those into the Q&A. And I want to make sure I can answer your questions real time here. Okay. Our agenda today, we're going to keep this pretty simple. We're going to start by just understanding a little bit more about NetLease, whether it's your first time seeing it or a refresher from last year. Want to make sure you understand just how it works broadly, how to navigate it, some features. We do have some new features. So if you used it last year, there's probably some things you haven't seen in the last few months that have been recently added. So just want to make sure you're aware of those. After we've covered some just high-level navigation of NetLease, we're going to jump into some more actual accounting training here. So we're going to do another kind of review, but this time over the actual accounting for 842. We're going to talk about some basics around it. Then we're going to jump into year 2 considerations. So things that maybe you weren't super concerned about last year, but you ought to be really thinking about this year. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about what may be different this year from last year as far as owning the process of doing the lease accounting actually going forward. All right. Real quick here, after the webinar, you're going to receive my information, Jen's information, a recording of the webinar. Jen already mentioned that, but also this slide deck here. So if there's something valuable you see in here, don't feel like you have to take real heavy notes here. You're going to have a copy of this slide deck afterwards. So it'll all be there for you. Okay, we're going to do one of our polling questions right off the bat here. So if we want to kick that off real quick here, first question is, what stage best describes your organization's progress in implementing year 2 lease accounting changes? So I'm just going to pause here. We'll give everybody a chance to answer that without feeling like they're going to miss something. We'll give everybody just a few more seconds here, and then we're going to move on. Okay, perfect. All right, well, with that, we're going to jump right into NetLease itself. So I am going to pull that up on my screen here. Okay, so what I've got set up today is actually a little Haney example client I've built together. So we're going to focus on a few different stages of NetLease. I would love to look at some first support things. I want to make sure you all understand how the software can help you through this next year of accounting. After we've gone through the support that we're able to offer through the software itself, we're going to look at just some basic setup things. Maybe you've got a setup for the first time this year, or maybe there's some changes that you probably should have made last year and we want to get done now. And then after that, we're going to do a high-level review of actually adding leases as well, just so that if anybody has follow-up questions there, they can ask those. All right. So the first place we want to point to is down here at the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. You will find this on every page within NetLease. You have got this blue circle with a little white question mark. We call this our resource. Yeah.
We're just seeing your slides right now. It went over.
Oh, gosh, thank you so much.
Yep.
Let's reshare here and make sure that gets pulled up. Okay, let's try this again. Let me know. Are we seeing it now?
Yeah, now we see it.
Okay, thank you so much, Jen.
Yep.
All right. So as a recap, because you didn't see what I was talking about, I'm pointing down here to the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. We've got a little blue circle with that white question mark. If I click on that, that's going to show you our resource center. And this is going to be where 90% of the support will be found within the software. There's a few different things in here. One of them is old, which is our knowledge base. It's been around since we've started here. If you click on knowledge base, it's going to take you to a separate website here that has answers to any question you may have about lease accounting. So we have questions about actually navigating the software itself. So you can see we've got a training video here. If you like videos instead of just reading, we've got you covered there. It's got bookmarks, so you can click on here and see exactly what topic you want to learn about. General admin, NetLease for clients, system setup. I'm really anything you can ever imagine we're covering in here. In addition, though, to actually navigating the software, we have a whole technical accounting section. And this, I think, will be really valuable to everybody, whether you're on the audit side, whether you're from Haney or a client. So in here, we're going to have topics covering really any of the big ticket items you may come across with lease accounting. And it's not just limited to 842 either. Practical expedience, transition methods. Hopefully all of you are past that year one of having to figure out the transition method. If you're a little bit slow and you're still doing no, that's going to be helpful to you. Lease incentives, renewal options, variable lease payments, really anything that you may be stressed about. I'm not sure how I deal with in this new standard. We've got you covered there. So this is a really helpful site, and it's got a ton of information, but understandably, it might be a little overwhelming to figure out how do I find answers to questions. I don't know where to look in this menu. We do have a search bar that's going to be pretty easy to be able to just type in like the topic you want to look at. You can type in discount rate here, and you're going to see that it'll pull up an article. So that's a little bit easier way to do it. But I'm excited to share a much easier way to find answers to your question. And that is going to be this little box you can see. It says ask about lease accounting. So one of our earliest clients actually was OpenAI. They're a NetLease user as well. They use a lot of our NetGain products. As I imagine everybody on this call knows, they created ChatGPT, and we partnered with them to use ChatGPT-4 to be able to provide answers to your questions. Now, if you've used ChatGPT, you know that one of the challenges there is that you don't know if the answer it gives you is something it made up, because the whole idea is it's predicting what the next words should be, or if it's the actual answer. We've created a walled garden though. So now if you type a question into here, it is only going to reference our information that we've created here. So you can trust whatever it's giving you is not what they call a hallucination in AI talk here. So I could ask the question, how do I enter a modification? Or even how do I deal with a modification? Just a plain English question. And what you're going to see here is it's going to give you step-by-step response. You don't have to read through an entire article. It's going to be very limited to exactly the question you asked, tell you how to deal with it. And what I think is actually one of the most beneficial pieces here is it cites its source. That's a big frustration for any other AI model. So you have no idea where it got its information. I can click on this here, and it's actually going to take me to our knowledge base where you can see where it scrubbed that information from, and you've got additional screenshots. So that is a super helpful tool. It doesn't matter which side you're on, whether you're from Haiti or a client here, you will all have access to this AI feature. And that's not like an added cost feature or anything like that. Okay, so that is our resource center, some really helpful things there. When we enter a lease in just a minute, I'm going to show you a few more helpful features. Let's jump over to some admin stuff though, real quick. So I clicked on admin, and just so you're aware, I'm looking at our client side of the tool. So if you're from Haiti, you're going to have a slightly different view. You will have firm clients as another option here. And when you click on admin, it's going to take you to the firm's admin page. We're looking at a client's admin page right now. So this would be a client, they pull it up. You're going to need to do some initial setup, and we're not going to go through setting up a whole company today. There are some new things I want to make sure you're aware of. In the last year, we've added the ability to set a fiscal end month. So if you're a non-calendar year-end company, you're going to need to be able to run disclosures with those appropriate dates. You want to come in and set the appropriate month here for your fiscal end. Accounting standard, that's always been there. We found a lot of companies overlooked that initially though. Make sure you've got that set correctly. And expense convention. This is a pretty common one. We get a lot of questions around. This is the new default setting. If you're not set up to partial month expense convention right now, I would go ahead and update that and make sure that you are. So going forward, you don't have any issues there. Another feature that's been there the whole time, but has been underutilized and I think is going to be really helpful going forward is these segment options. So you can see for this client, I have set up subsidiary, department, and location. We're giving you the ability to break up your lease portfolio into bite-sized pieces for reporting purposes. So for subsidiary, you can see that's been labeled here. I've added a few options, sub 1 and sub 2. Department 1 and 2, I wasn't very creative here, and location, central, northwest, and southwest. So this is, you may not ever need to use this, but if you have unique reporting requirements where you've got to break out your leases into whatever custom categories, this is really going to help you do that. You've always been able to create custom lease types. You can still do that today. You can also do some unique GL coding. So if I was to click on this here, you could actually come in, we can edit this. And you can create your own account names and account numbers. So if you want to be able to run journal entry reports and see your own account names and own account numbers instead of just our default account names, that's something you can do. But I am very excited to be able to share that we've got one step further here now with integrations. So if you are a QuickBooks user, this is going to be really awesome for you. As long as you've got a NetLease license, no additional cost here, you will be able to link NetLease now to QuickBooks. You're going to be able to do some mapping there. It's a really easy process to go through. You set it up, and then going forward, you just click a button and it pushes the entries directly into QuickBooks for you. You can see this just appeared here. I can click Connect QuickBooks, and it's going to allow me to do that. So we're not going to demo that whole process. I don't want to bore you today, but if you are a QuickBooks user and you would love to get this set up, reach out to Jen, reach out to me, and we're happy to get you going on that so that you can save yourself quite a bit of pain and effort there. Lastly here, firm access. This is a somewhat new feature. If you've been with us for a year, this is a little bit newer for you. Just so you're aware, we do grant all clients the ability to change the type of access they want their auditors to have. So you can see Haney Webinar Demo has given NetGain CPA firm full access here, but they can change that to limit that. If you have concerns at all about independence or anything like that, we've put the power in your hands to do that. Okay, talked about some new features here, talked about some unique custom setup that you can do. I do want to see from either side of the table here, whether you're an auditor or a client, if anybody has any questions about any of this setup that maybe is giving them trouble or they're concerned about, so I can respond to those real quick. So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds here to see if anything comes through. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. If you're typing something and you're about to hit submit and I've turned away, I'll ask Jen to just flag me down and I'll respond to that question here. Okay, so we took a look at some of the good admin features here. Let's go ahead now and actually generate a lease together. You can see I've created 2 leases in here already. I want to show you, I can click on new lease at the top right here. And this process is pretty easy. I imagine most of you on this call today have already done this before, so I don't want to bore you here. We're going to do it pretty quickly. We have some new awesome options I want to show you. The biggest one is our AI lease contract assistant. So again, using ChatGPT, we have now created the feature where you can click upload files here. And I am actually going to do this in real time with us here. It takes about, 20 seconds or so. So let me just grab it real quick. Just going to grab a PDF that I can use as an example. Let's grab a good one here. Okay. I'm going to pull this up. And what you're going to see is on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got all of your inputs here. On the right-hand side of the screen is the PDF we just uploaded. You're going to see that we've got a legend at the top, and it's now going through your entire document and pulling out all of that relevant information, and it's actually going to populate it here on the left. So it's usually 15 or 20 seconds per page is what it takes to read, analyze, and then notate everything and fill it in. So we'll just give it a second. There we go. Successfully scanned our page here. So what we can see is it's pulled the name in here. Lease type is something you do need to manually update, as well as the classification. It's relying on a human to make sure that classification is correct. You can see it's grabbed May 1st, 2023 as my commencement date, and 4/30/2025 at my termination date. My payments here, you can see it starts on 5/1, which is our first payment here, and you can see it's $7,500, which is what is notated here as well. So this is not doing 100% of the work for you. As with all AI, there's concern about it stealing people's work. It'll always need a human because it does about 80%, and then it relies on a human to do the last 20% of review, make sure nothing was missed or incorrect, and then you can simply click on Jump to Lease Creation, and it's going to pull all of this information for you and drop it here into our input fields. So super, super handy. Whether you're new to the software or not, you've probably not seen that feature. Highly encourage you to start playing around with that. Use it for this upcoming busy season. It can be a big time saver. I want to point out in the Documents tab here, you are going to see that it's pulled in the original PDF, the marked up one, as well as the one that we have actually marked up as well, or highlighted here. That's super helpful if you've got a long PDF and you're going to review something, maybe in the audit, and you don't want to have to scroll through page after page to try to find that. Everything's going to be highlighted, right? So it's easy for you to obtain that information very quickly. Okay.
We do have a question that's coming in. How does this deal with amendments to lease contracts? And we'll be going over amendments shortly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. That's a big focus for us today. That's something we know year one, probably many of you weren't dealing with. Year two, it's quite likely that you're starting to see amendments. So I'm going to show you real quick. We'll do it very fast so that if you've seen this before, you aren't bored. how to input one of these leases. And then that lease we create right now, we are actually going to amend in just a few minutes here after we've talked about what to be considering. Okay, we can just keep the same name here, and I'm actually going to make this a real estate lease for now. And we can keep the same dates here. We're going to make up a discount rate. We'll say that it's 3.75. Okay, and I'm actually going to make this one just a little bit longer here. All right, we can keep our payments. That's totally fine. We're going to use some of those segments that we set up earlier, right? So I can say this is subsidiary 1, department 2, and it belongs to Northwest location as well. Okay. There is a classification tool if you're not familiar with this. Year 1, this wasn't super important because you already knew the classification of leases you were bringing over from 840 to 842. But if you're signing a new lease this year, you're going to need to make sure you've classified that correctly. And this little button down here is going to take you to an interactive tool. It's got the 5 criteria. You can respond to each one, and it'll tell you the appropriate classification for that lease. So highly recommend that you use this. The nice thing is if you complete this, those inputs will be saved for you as well. So we'll go ahead and create this lease. It takes just a second. It's going to save the information and create a amortization schedule for us. This schedule is just like you'd expect. Every row represents our period. Our first row, period 0, so showing the gross up to the balance sheet here. And then you actually have in the second row, period 1, where we see our straight line lease expense and our payments being calculated as well. A few other things real quick to highlight. We've got an audit trail for you to be able to track who's doing what. So again, if you're a client and you're accessing the software and the auditors are accessing the software, this is a great way to keep straight who's doing what in the software. You have a chance to review everything. That's why we start in draft. But after you've done that, you can come in here, commence lease. And once you've commenced your lease, we're going to look in that drop-down menu. We now have the ability to modify a lease. So we're not going to modify it quite yet. We're going to be looking at that in a few minutes from now, but just wanted to show you where you'd find that. So let's pause again here. Again, we're being pretty high level, pretty quick today on showing you how to actually navigate the software. If you've never seen this before and you're pretty interested, we can do a full demo with you. It'll take much longer, go through every little feature. But I do want to pause to see if there's any questions about how I input a lease here and anything around that. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come in. I promised I'd show you one more tool that you can use here when you're actually creating leases. You saw that I just freehand typed everything in here. Well, in our guided tours, I could have clicked Lease Assistant, and you're going to see it's going to have me now create a new lease or edit this lease. It looks like to do this. And it looks like we're not in draft. So it's going to tell us, this is a nice thing. It tells us exactly how to do this. So telling us we can only edit it if it's not active. So what we can do is we'll create a new lease. We're not going to go through the whole process, don't worry, but I wanted to show you we have a lease assistant that'll guide you through step-by-step how to create a lease. So that's just one more resource available to you. Okay, I haven't seen anything else come in, so we're actually going to pause here on our demo now, come back over to our presentation and talk a little bit more about the basics of ASC 842. But let's pause first and do a polling question number 2. I'll give everybody just a few seconds again here to respond to this. All right, let's move along then. Okay, so this is just a review from last year. Hopefully you're well aware of this, but we want to talk about what changed from 840 to 842. Maybe you're looking at this going, well, maybe you're a client saying, hey, they did this last year. Frankly, I don't really understand what changed. I know they did it for us and they did it right, but I'd like to know. We're going to make that a little bit easier for you today. So previously, under ASC 840, only capital leases were captured on the balance sheet. Operating leases were referred to as being off balance sheet leases, which was great. It was convenient for a lot of people. The issue with that, though, was it allowed some pretty big companies we saw kind of in the headlines in the early 2000s were able to kind of hide activities and I wouldn't say falsify, but maybe mislead a little bit on what their financials actually looked like because they had significant amount of leases that were not showing any sort of liabilities. because they were operating leases. That's now changed. The bright lines that were used under 840 are now gone. No more bright lines under 842. So all leases now, virtually all leases, I mean, there's some short-term and low-value leases that are excluded, but everything else is now going to be reflected on the balance sheet. We have a new account created as a result of that, which is a right-of-use asset account. And then you're going to have a corresponding lease liability as well. The good news around this, hopefully you've all seen this now, is that there's no real P&L change. This is the balance sheet gross up here, but there shouldn't have been a huge impact to your P&L at all. And you can see here on the right, we're just showing, all these off-balance sheets now from 840 appear as well. So that's just the basics here of what's changed. We can look at some examples though, because this is where it really becomes clear how significant this change was from 840 to 842. So a very basic vehicle lease here, right, under 840. It was pretty simple. We'll say a 3-year lease, $500 a month, no down payment, just your basic operating lease. That was the easiest thing to record ever. Anybody could do that. Debit that vehicle expense every month, credit AP, cash, whatever it was, every month. No problem. We look at 842 and all of a sudden that has become significantly more complicated. So now we have an initial balance entry, initial journal entry here, grossing up the balance sheet. That's what we're looking at here. This is our right of use asset and our lease liability. And honestly, when people are concerned and worried about 842, that's usually the piece right there that's causing the most concern. It's tough to calculate that. Using Excel to calculate that can be pretty time intensive, oftentimes error prone as well. Using the effective interest method to calculate that, there's a lot that goes into it. Oftentimes it's being calculated wrong. So that's where software is going to come into play. Hopefully you've used software this last year and seen that. Now though, we're going to get that, we're going to take the present value of all of our payments to get the lease liability and the offset to our asset. And then every month, we just got to burn that down. So if we look, our first debit and our last credit, those should look very familiar. Still a debit to the expense and a credit to payable. And that's going to stay the same every month because we're using a straight line lease expense. What's going to be changing though is our liability and our credit, or to the credit of the right of use asset accumulated amortization. The effective interest method results in a changing lease liability month over month. And this is why using software is so important, because it's much harder to calculate what that is going to be every month going forward. And I actually kind of want to pause here. Jen and I have had a great relationship. We've talked over the last few years, so I know the pain she's experienced, and maybe some of her team has experienced prior to using software. I would just love to hear from you, Jen, how software, like what the difference in your experience has been like trying to do this, manually versus using software.
Yeah, I was smiling as you were talking about this because I remember a couple years ago when I was trying to do this in Excel, and it was so hard. We just had these huge Excel sheets to take care of a simple lease, and I kept saying there's got to be a better way. And so it was time intensive, and then I wasn't sure if I actually had every single formula correct. So I just had a lot of questions. I wasn't confident. And so switching over and using NetLease has been a huge change. I can do them way quicker, and I just have a lot more confidence that I'm doing them correctly. So I think everyone, all of the employees at Haney, I think they would all agree with me that it's way better than when we were trying to use Excel.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And Jen mentioned at the beginning, I was doing consulting prior to this. I did not know that software existed. I was helping a lot of public companies implement 842 back in 2018 and 2019. It took, I'm probably dumber than Jen, probably didn't take her this long, but it would take us 4 to 6 hours to do a lease in Excel, that initial very, very painful process. And I felt like I was working with some of the best and brightest. So yeah, it's a significant time saver here. Okay, well, let's jump over now to talk about lease classifications. Hopefully this is old news to everybody. Just a quick recap here. We've got operating, financing, short-term and low value. So operating leases, you're going to recognize your lease expense on a straight line basis, have that right of use asset, corresponding lease liability, everything we've just been talking about. This is new for operating leases, and we just looked at what it looked like previously. Financing leases, no real change here. And we're not calling them capital, so there's a change to name, and there's a few small little changes that have to be made for implementing from capital to financing. It's pretty easy to do, but no real huge changes for my financing here. Short-term and low value, these are going to be the sweet escape for some folks that have very minimal leases here. So your chance to get out of 842. So short-term is going to be anything that's less than 12 months. You're not going to have a balance sheet impact, which is fantastic. There are some caveats here that can catch up folks that thinks they have a short-term lease. For example, if you have a short-term lease that renews every year, you may not actually have a short-term lease. On 842, the FASB really wants to get you. You're going to have to consider, well, maybe that 12-month lease is actually a 24, 36-month lease if you are renewing every single year. But if you do happen to fall into that, that's some good news and you can save some effort here. Low value leases. These, it's harder to determine this. I mentioned that we got rid of bright lines earlier. Previously, it was very clear what was a low value lease. And to be honest, the rest of the world actually has made it easier. If you're looking at the IFRS 16 standard, it's a very specific number. We don't have that here today. But the number that most people are using is your fixed asset threshold. So $5,000 is a common number I see. If your right of use asset, your lease liability is below $5,000, a lot of companies are saying, okay, we're going to call this low value, and there's not going to be any balance sheet impact here either for these particular leases. The one thing you do have to be a little careful of here is leases have to be immaterial, not only individually, but in aggregate. So maybe you've got copiers and they're all immaterial, but you've got 1,000 copiers. So in aggregate, they are not immaterial. That might be a scenario where you actually do have to adopt 842 for what appears to be a whole bunch of low value leases. Hopefully this is old news, but I do want to pause on here to see if we have any questions. I saw that Jen just responded to a question about the recording. Any questions around classifications here? Okay, that's great. Let's talk about transition methods then. Again, a little bit old news here. You have two options. We have been strongly recommending one over the other. The first one is the effective method here. This just is allowing you to apply the standard going forward. This is only available to private companies. Public companies did not have this huge relief. But for private companies, if your cutover date is, if you're a calendar year end, that would be 1/1/2022. You only have to show from 1/1/22 going forward. Under 842, you can still present your prior years under 840, so a lot less work. The comparative method of adoption says that anything you're presenting in your financial statements, so if you're showing 3 years, all 3 of those years need to be presenting under 842. So a lot of retroactive work that has to occur here. Hopefully we're all well past this year. If not, and you've got questions, feel free to drop them in or just reach out to us afterwards. Discount rates, again, just a quick review here. You've got 3 options as a private company. There have been some confusion around this. In the last 12 months, I have got a lot of questions actually around this topic. So we do want to make sure we've got this cleared up. The first option is the rate implicit in the lease. This is what the FASB would refer to as your preferential rate. And to be honest, it's the rate you should want to use as well if it's available to you. This is essentially the profit margin that the lessor is going to make on the lease. And for that reason, pretty rare that you're going to find that in your lease agreement. There's a few types of leases like vehicle leases or equipment where it's far more likely that you are going to see this in there, but pretty unlikely for like land and real estate, which makes up the vast majority of the leases for folks. If you have that rate, you need to use that rate. You actually don't have an option. You need to be using the rate implicit in the lease. It's generally going to be a much higher rate though, which is great because it's going to result in a lower liability on your balance sheet. Okay, the next 2 options though, let's say you don't have that, you get to now choose as a private company between the incremental borrowing rate, which we refer to as the IBR, and the risk-free rate. The IBR, you can think of that as essentially the rate you would have to be paying the market rate if you were going to go borrow the funds to purchase the asset that you're leasing today. It can be kind of costly and time intensive to obtain that. So most private companies simply aren't using the IBR and they're using the risk-free rate. But we've got some fantastic tools for you. If you're going to use that risk-free rate going forward, you need to calculate that. We've got some free tools that you can use to help calculate that. It makes it super, super easy. Any questions on discount rates? Jen, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on this here. If not, totally fine.
I would say I tell people, I think this is the trickiest part of inputting the lease. I get a lot of questions about this. And also I refer people a lot to the knowledge base that we were talking about in the beginning of the webinar. the knowledge base in NetLease, I refer people to go look at that article because it just lays it out really nicely in plain English.
Awesome. Great. Okay, well, that takes us through the kind of the recap on 842. So we're about to jump into preparing for day two. The first topic is going to be modifications. So Stefan, we're going to get to your question here. Before I do that though, I wanted to see if there was anything we haven't covered, just some basics about 842. If anybody has any of those questions, I'm happy to be a resource for you right now. So feel free to drop a question right now in Q&A. Looks like Brent has raised his hand. Looks like he's got a follow-up question here. I don't think, as I'm not a host, because I'm not a panelist, or I'm just a panelist, I can't respond to that. But Brent, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into Q&A. We're happy to answer that. I just want to make sure we can cover any of these recap basic questions people might have. And maybe your question was answered, Brent. I'm going to give you just a second in case you're typing it up, though. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anything come in. Brent, if you end up having a question, I'll be watching for it, and I'm happy to respond to it here. Okay. Well, let's start talking about day two. So day two, this is, year two, you're now a year into adoption of 842. What are things that you really should be thinking about? A big one here is modifications. So just a reminder, modification is going to be change in terms or conditions of a lease agreement that results in a change of the scope of the lease. There's a lot of things that qualify as a modification. Steph, you asked about amendments. Under 840, that was the common language, was amendment. The technical language here under 842 is, we call it a modification. So we've got 5 steps that you're going to need to follow here with a modification. First, you've got to figure out if this amendment or modification actually was resulting in a brand new contract. It's possible that is the case. It's not super common, but if it is, you're actually going to have to record a new lease. So that's just step one, determine whether or not it represents or creates a new contract. Step number 2 is you need to now reassess lease classification. A very basic modification, like simply an extension of lease term, that's usually not going to result in a change of classification, but you may have other modifications that will result, trigger that lease classification change there. So you've got to make sure you evaluate those same 5 criteria and see now, based on the new information in this amended lease, if that changes what your classification is. Step 3, you now need to recalculate the lease liability and the right of use asset based on these terms. One of the challenges here, which is so frustrating, as Jen just mentioned, discount rate, that's like one of the hardest parts of implementation. Well, whenever you have a modification, FASB requires that you use a new discount rate as of the effective date of that modification. So unfortunately, that is not a one-time pain. That's something you have to deal with every time you have a modification. And this is a big part of where I personally think software is hugely beneficial. I mentioned it took 4 to 6 hours off sometimes to do initial adoption. Well, the thing that really broke all of my spreadsheets, formulas just got messed up, honestly, was modifications. So that was the more painful part of the process than even implementation. Step 4, you've got to recognize a gain or loss that might result from any sort of changes, right? A common one would be maybe you've changed the scope of how much you're leasing. You've leased now additional square footage or reduced square footage. You've changed some dates here. Those could result in like a gain or a loss, and you've got to make sure that you're accounting for that correctly. Software, it's going to take care of all of that for you. And then lastly, of course, updating your disclosures accordingly, which all of this, frankly, doing it by hand is certainly feasible, really time intensive. Updating all of your disclosures manually with modifications is an hours-long process versus moments in the software. I would love to answer any questions on this. I'm also going to cover terminations here in a second, and then we'll pause and take questions around both modifications and terminations. And we're actually going to look in the software and do it together real quick as well. Okay, terminations here. Step 1, first, you've got to identify lease agreements that are terminated during that reporting period. So this is kind of an after the fact here. We assume that most of you haven't done the accounting. If you had a lease that was terminated during the year, you're now having to consider, okay, how do I account for that lease that was terminated? So evaluate any leases that have terminated during the year. determine the accounting treatment based on the circumstances of the termination. So we got kind of a couple options here. If it was terminated just as planned, right, the lease ended essentially, you're just going to recognize the remaining liability and right of use asset accordingly, right? You're going to be removing the rest of that liability. You've got all of that accumulated amortization you're pulling off the books. That's a pretty easy one. If the lease is terminated due to some other reason, though non-planned, then you're going to have, settlement or penalties that are going to have to be applied. Oftentimes, you're going to have a loss resulting in an early termination. So that's another thing to consider. Step 3, this is one that's actually not oftentimes thought about, and that's going to be sublease arrangements. So you terminated a lease, and as part of that termination, though, you've now sublet that. You've got to make sure that you are now complying with a whole new set of standards around subleases there. We've got guidance around that. Just wanted to drop this in. I don't have a lot to mention on step 3, but wanted to make sure if you happen to enter into any subleases during the year, that's its own set of guidance. You're going to need to make sure you've complied there. Step 4, you've got to now update all of your amortization schedules and accounting entries to reflect the changes there. Similar to modifications, that can be a painful process doing it by hand, piece of cake, just a matter of seconds in software though. And then again, step 5, update your disclosures accordingly. So those are our steps. Those are the things you really need to be considering as you're thinking about modifications and terminations. And again, we're going to send all of these slides to you so you'll have that good checklist for you. Any questions, though, before we actually do this together within NetLease? Happy to respond to those. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through, so let's do it together now. Let's answer Stefan's question. Okay, so we're going to come back here. I've clicked on leases. This is where I can see my portfolio. We're going to look at this lease that we have created together. It's active right now. So we'll click on that. And you are seeing my screen, right, Jen? Nothing got messed up there? Okay, great.
Yeah, I see it.
Awesome. So now I'm going to click on lease actions, and we're going to modify this lease. What you see here is in the top of this, you have got all the current lease information. And then on the bottom piece here is where we're actually going to be changing information. So the most common amendment that you're probably going to come across is a basic extension of the lease. It's pretty common. You'll have a renewal option. And under 842, just so you're aware, you actually should have evaluated whether or not you expected to exercise that renewal option when you adopted 842. And if it was fully expected, that renewal option should have actually been included in your original lease term. So maybe it was written as a 3-year with a 2-year renewal. You should have a 5-year lease upon adoption, if you fully expect to exercise that. We're going to go through here, though, assuming that you did that evaluation and said, nope, we are not planning on exercising that renewal option. And now a few years have gone by, right? We said this commenced 2023. Well, maybe we're now into 2024 and something has changed for it, right? We need to exercise that. So we would come in here. We're going to mark the effective date. That's the date that you make that decision, essentially, right? That you're going to renew. We'll keep this really easy. We're going to say that it happened on 5/1 of 2024. And we've extended our lease now. We'll make say 2 more years. So it's 2028 now is our new lease end date. This is a standard modification. We're just remeasuring our lease liability. We're not decreasing our scope at all. It's just an increase of scope. If you do have a decrease in scope, that's going to be its own separate type. And then an impairment of your right of use asset. Think about like a vehicle that's been totaled or something like that. That's going to be its own unique type as well. We'll just do one of these here. I mentioned that discount rate has to be updated every time. So we'd have to go recalculate what that new discount rate is as of the effective date. It's good clarification for everybody. When you're figuring out what that new rate is, it's as of the effective date to the new end date. So we'll say that's jumped all the way up to 4.35. Okay, and you could just click modify lease at this point. It's pretty common though to see with like a renewal that you'll have new payment terms as well within that renewal period. So we'll say, I think we started in 2027. So we'll say just 1/1 of 2027. Now we've jumped up to like $9,000 by that time. So I can just click modify lease here and all of that information is going to be captured for us. You give it just a second. Okay, so we have our new end date here, our new discount rate, and our new lease term. If we look at the schedule, under 842, historical data should remain the same prior to this modification, but we can scroll down and see that this occurred on 5/1 of 2024. Well, that row has now been broken out to 13.1 and 13.2 here. right? 13.1 is the gross up to the balance sheet. 13.2, we see our new straight line lease expense being calculated, taking into account the new term, the new payments, and the new discount rate. And then we can scroll down to the very bottom of our lease here and confirm we end when we would expect 68 months later with our liability and asset burning down to zero. It's going to be pretty common. You're going to want to make sure you've done your modification correctly. We track all of that information here so you can see all of your modifications. And let's say you did it wrong. Somebody came in and did it wrong. Don't worry. In our lease actions menu, you can always just click reverse modification. It'll undo what you did. You're back to your starting point, so you can try again if you need to. You can also look in the audit trail and see exactly what was changed as a result of that modification. So, Stefan, hopefully your question was answered here. But I do want to pause to see if you or anybody else has any follow-up questions on modifications. These are pain to deal with. They can be pretty complicated at times. So I want to make sure everybody's prepared. It looks like I did see one just come in to clarify. Does the AI lease contract assistant have any use for lease modifications, or is just for uploading the initial lease? Great question. So you're talking about the field that was right up here initially. That is just for new leases. That's a great idea, though, and that's actually something that I'll have to run by our dev team to see. It's currently only for new leases, but if I'm understanding you, you're probably saying we've got a new amended document right now with this modification. Can we have the software evaluate that as well? Something I'm happy to reach out about. At the very least, what I'm going to recommend you do, pull up this Documents tab and upload it here as well so that you do have a record of that. But really, really great question there. Currently, it is only limited to new leases using the AI tool. Okay. I haven't seen any other questions come in about modifications. If you're having more questions later, of course, you've got Jen, and you've also got my whole team here at NetGain. We're happy to respond to questions real time if you run into any issues. Let's look at terminations, though, as well now. So I'm going to click on Terminate Lease there in the Lease Actions menu. This is even easier to do, and we're not actually going to terminate this lease right now, but what you would do is just type in the date of termination, total payments made, and then any cash that was received at the date of termination. And then once you enter this, it's actually going to give you all the journal entries you'll need for that final entry to remove the lease off your books. So pretty simple process there. Okay. Well, with that, we are going to jump back over here to the software or to the PowerPoint, and we got another question here. So let's pause, give everybody a chance to respond to polling question number 3. All right, hopefully you've had enough time here to think about and respond to that question. If you've said definitely, Haney's going to let me know, and we may do a follow-up here on this as well. Let's talk about another issue or challenge around day 2. So this is something I actually hear pretty frequently. Like, look, NetLease was really nice to have for year 1. Problem is there's high turnover, and this is just industry-wide with accountants. Doesn't matter whether you're on the audit side or the industry side. Turnover is a huge issue with accounting. And with audits looming, again, doesn't matter which side of the coin you're on here, that can be a challenge, right? So big items to consider here: knowledge transfer protocols. Does your current team understand how your team last year dealt with adoption of the new standard? Continuous training programs, kind of what we're doing today, right? Making sure that everybody's up to date on what has changed over the year for actual accounting for our leases. And then good documentation and resources. So those are going to be your 3 big ticket items that I would personally recommend you be really focused on as you're headed into this, audit season to make sure that you're ready to go. And we've got a few items here that I'm going to say. So first off, these are why NetLease is so much easier. The knowledge transfer protocols, we've worked really hard to make sure that we're giving you lease records that can just be your single source of truth. It's got an audit trail here. You've got a spot for notes. You've got everything you want to be able to dictate, any type of documents you want to upload. So if somebody brand new is coming in to deal with leases, maybe you've hired a new controller and they don't know anything about your lease portfolio, they can log into NetLease and see exactly how it was done last year, all the notes around what occurred there, all the questions that went between Haney and you as the client, and it's all going to be there. Continuous training programs, That's what we're doing today. But I just wanted to offer to all the clients that are here today, just so you're aware, we're happy to extend this type of training to you as well. This is not just limited to the CPA firms that we work with. If you have ongoing needs and you need your team to be trained on NetLease, we're happy to help you out with that. I know Haney's got you covered on lease accounting. And if they would like, we're happy to help with that as well. And then documentation and resources. This kind of goes back to the knowledge transfer protocol, but it is essential to have good document keeping, right? And that's why we've got the document storage there, multiple spots for notes and the audit trail so that you can just have all the documentation you need. And then the resources here, that's why I wanted to start out with that today. Make sure you knew about the knowledge base, our AI NetLease Copilot. That was the question thing that we were using. So that going forward, if you have new people that don't know anything about the lease accounting this year, they will have all the resources available to them. Okay, last piece here that we talked about on the agenda is just taking ownership of your lease accounting. So year one, I think the vast majority of clients across the country, not just Haney's clients, many people said, we're going to pay our CPA firm to do our lease accounting. Totally understand that. Super intimidating. You may now feel that year two, I'd like to understand more about our lease portfolio. I'd like to take some ownership of that. But the big challenge here is, right, it's pretty intimidating. Probably don't want to learn everything about 842 and everything there is to know. This software is really going to make that much easier for you. So we can train and support your accounting department. If they need a full hour of a deep dive into 842 so they feel confident taking over their lease accounting, great. We're happy to help with that. A big benefit here of NetLease is Jen and her whole team here, they've already done, right, a lot of the implementation work. If you were to take ownership now, and you get your own access to NetLease, when you log in, you're not starting from a clean slate. Your entire portfolio will be waiting for you there, right? So you don't have to re-enter all this information. They've done, frankly, 95% of the work. The hard part's already done, and now it's just the ongoing support. And that's what this last piece here is. The implementation work is retained, so you're starting from a really great place here. Okay. We have one more polling question, and then I would like to give just a few minutes for questions. We've had a couple come in so far. We have enough time that I can answer any more questions. And then I'm also going to turn things over to Jen. I know she had a few things she wanted to share as well. So let's just do our last polling question here. Give everybody a chance to respond to this. And then with our last, I think we've got, oh, perfect. Yeah, about 7 minutes left here. That can be, some of that for questions, and then give Jen a few more minutes as well. Okay, this is a pretty easy question here. So I'm going to hand things over to you, Jen, but please feel free as she's talking, put some questions here into our Q&A and I'll respond to those.
All right. Thank you so much, Caleb, for doing this. I think this is super helpful for everyone that attended today. And so as we were talking about it, I think everyone can agree with me that tackling ASC 842 without software is really complex. So our partnership with NetGain provides efficiencies for both you as a client and us as the auditors. If you use NetLease, we as the auditors can see your lease entries in real time as you enter them in. And it just is easier for us as auditors if you've already entered it in and we have that partnership through NetLease. So because of that, we really recommend that you subscribe to NetLease. If you're interested in an annual subscription, you don't have one yet, you can email me, jenc@haneycpas.com. We'll get this information out. You can also just talk to whichever auditor you're working with, and they can also get you your subscription to NetLease. So we just want to be here as a resource for you as you tackle this. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have, and we're really grateful for you guys all attending today's webinar, but we want to give it a chance. If you have any questions, now is your time. We have the expert on the line. So yeah, everyone type in any questions that you have remaining in the last couple minutes.
And while we're waiting for those questions, just a huge thank you to everybody. Appreciate you joining today. We had great attendance, about 70 people on the call today. I really appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the questions that have come through. And thanks so much to Haney for allowing me to be here today. Does the auditor for NetGain provide annual certifications of the software? Great question. Yes, we have SOC reports. We've got the current SOC 1 report. We're actually waiting on our auditors right now to get our SOC 1 and SOC 2 report. It should be here this week. Jen's been waiting very patiently for me to provide that to her. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. We have auditors that are auditing our software to provide those SOC reports for you. Really good question.
And for Haney employees, I'll put any resources that we have related to NetLease, I put in the K drive, K NetLease folder. So that will go in there. Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm guessing we're also going to have a few questions about CPE credit, about how they'll get their certificates. So those will just come via email in the next few days, right?
Yep, absolutely. So we'll take all the information from attendance today. I've got a team that I'll be sending that off to. They'll generate those certificates, and then you will get an email with that certificate attached here shortly. Okay. Well, that puts us about at time here. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I will hang around here. I think Haney's planning on leaving this open here. So in case you joined a few minutes late, you're not going to be dinged if you jump off a little bit early here. Feel free to leave if you've been here the full time and you're good to go. Otherwise, I'm just going to hang around and I can answer any questions that do pop up.
Thank you, everyone.